She was sent to care for the mad Heir, but she became the only one who recognized his pain. Ariba never imagined that one decision would change her life so deeply. She was only 24, but responsibility had already shaped her into someone much older in spirit. After her father fell seriously ill and could no longer work, the small income that kept their household running disappeared almost overnight. Medical bills began to pile up on the wooden table in their tiny living room. Her younger brother was still studying, and her mother tried to hide her worry behind quiet smiles. But Ariba could see it in her eyes every single day. She had completed her education with good grades, but finding a stable job was not easy. She worked small shifts wherever she could, helping children with homework, assisting at a clinic, even doing temporary office work. None of it paid enough. Every night before sleeping, she would count the money in her drawer and calculate how many days it could last. Each time, the number felt smaller. One afternoon, while returning from a short tutoring session, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She almost ignored it, thinking it was another advertisement, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. The caller introduced herself as a representative from a private placement agency. They had received Ariba's profile months ago when she had applied for caregiving work. A wealthy family was looking for a live-in caregiver for their only son. The pay was far higher than what she was currently earning. Accommodation and food would be provided. The contract was long-term. For a moment, Ariba could not speak. It sounded too good to be true. Then the woman's tone changed slightly. She explained that the position was challenging. The young man she would be caring for had behavioral issues. He was known to be difficult, unpredictable, and emotionally unstable. Several caregivers had left within weeks. The family was desperate to find someone patient and strong enough to stay. Ariba felt a cold wave pass through her chest. She had never handled a situation like that before. She asked what exactly was wrong with him. The woman paused before answering. He struggles with anger and isolation. The family refers to him as troubled. The staff sometimes call him the mad Heir, though not to his face. The words stayed in Ariba's mind long after the call ended. That evening, she told her mother everything. Her mother listened quietly, folding clothes in her lap. When Ariba mentioned the high salary, her mother's hands froze for a second. They both knew how much that money could help. Hospital treatments, her brother's school fees, rent, groceries. But fear was also present. "Do you feel safe taking this job?" her mother asked softly. Ariba did not have a clear answer. She was afraid. She had never lived away from home before. She did not know this family. She did not know the young man she was expected to care for. But she knew something else more clearly than her fear. She could not continue watching her family struggle like this. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about her father's tired face. She thought about her mother, pretending everything was fine. She thought about how her brother avoided asking for new books because he knew they could not afford them. By morning, her decision was made. She called the agency and accepted the offer. 2 days later, a black car arrived to take her to the estate. As the car drove through the city, tall buildings slowly gave way to large open roads lined with trees. The estate was located on the outskirts, far from crowded streets. When the tall iron gates opened, Ariba felt like she was entering another world. The house was enormous. White walls, wide balconies, and windows that reflected the sky. The garden was perfectly maintained, with trimmed hedges and fountains that sparkled under the sun. It looked beautiful, almost peaceful, but for some reason the air felt heavy. A middle-aged housekeeper greeted her at the entrance. Her smile was polite but tired. Inside, the floors shone like mirrors. Chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Everything looked expensive and carefully arranged, yet there was no warmth. The staff moved quietly, speaking in low voices. When Ariba mentioned she was the new caregiver, she noticed a quick exchange of looks between two maids. One of them shook her head slightly, as if warning her without words. Soon she was taken to meet the young man's father. He was a tall, well-dressed man with sharp features and a serious expression. His voice was controlled and firm. He explained the rules of the house. Professional behavior. No unnecessary conversations. Focus entirely on his son's well-being. "My son requires supervision," he said. "Does not respond well to authority, but he must be managed. If you can remain patient, you will be rewarded." She asked gently, "May I know what usually triggers him?" The father's jaw tightened slightly. "He refuses responsibility. He isolates himself. He creates problems where none exist." That answer felt incomplete, but she did not question further. Her room was located at the end of a long hallway on the second floor. It was comfortable and larger than her entire home back in the city. A soft bed, a wooden desk, a small balcony overlooking the garden. For a brief moment she felt guilty, enjoying it. As evening approached, she was told it was time to deliver dinner to the young heir's room. The tray felt heavier than it should have. She walked slowly down another hallway that seemed quieter than the rest of the house. At the end stood a large wooden door. It was closed. She knocked gently. No answer. A sharp voice came from inside. "Leave it outside." His tone was not loud, but it carried irritation. Ariba hesitated. She remembered her instructions. She was supposed to ensure he ate properly. Gathering her courage, she spoke calmly through the door. "I'm the new caregiver. I just want to make sure you have everything you need." Then footsteps approached. The door opened slightly, just enough for her to see part of his face. He looked younger than she expected, maybe in his late 20s. His hair was slightly messy, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But what struck her most was not anger, it was exhaustion. He looked at her for only a second before pushing the door wider. His room was dimly lit, curtains half closed. Books were scattered on a table. A guitar rested in one corner. He took the tray from her hands abruptly and placed it on his desk without looking at her. "You won't last long," he said flatly. The words were not shouted. They were spoken with certainty. Before she could respond, he closed the door. Ariba stood there for a few seconds, her heart beating fast. She felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. This was not the image of a dangerous or wild person she had imagined. He seemed distant, guarded, almost wounded. Later that night, as she unpacked her small suitcase, she heard a sudden crash echo through the hallway. Something heavy hitting the wall, a raised voice, then silence again. No one rushed toward the sound. It was as if they were used to it. Ariba stepped into the hallway, unsure of what to do. The air felt tense. She could feel that something was deeply wrong in this house, something no one wanted to speak about. She returned to her room and sat on the edge of her bed. Her mind replayed his tired eyes, the way he had spoken, not with rage, but with emptiness. She realized that this job would not be simple. It would test her patience, her courage, and maybe even her understanding of people. But as she looked around at the beautiful yet silent estate, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would not judge him based on rumors. She would observe, she would listen, and she would try. Because sometimes, behind the doors people fear the most, there is not madness. There is pain waiting to be understood. The next morning, Ariba woke up earlier than usual. For a few seconds she forgot where she was. The soft mattress beneath her and the silence around her felt unfamiliar, and reality returned. She was no longer in her small home in the city. She was inside a grand estate, hired to care for a young man everyone seemed afraid of. She freshened up and stepped out of her room. The hallway was quiet, but she could hear faint sounds coming from downstairs, the clinking of dishes, low voices, the normal rhythm of a large household starting its day. Everything looked peaceful on the outside. But she knew there was tension behind that peace. The housekeeper informed her that the heir, Zayan, rarely woke up before noon. He often skipped breakfast and preferred to stay inside his room. "Don't force him too much," the housekeeper whispered carefully. "It only makes things worse." Those words stayed with Ariba. Makes things worse. She wondered how bad it could get. Around 11, she prepared a light breakfast tray and walked toward his room again. Her steps felt more steady than the previous night. She reminded herself that she was not here to fear him. She was here to understand him. She knocked gently. No response. She waited and knocked again. After a few seconds, she heard movements inside. The door opened halfway. Zayan stood there, looking as if he had barely slept. His eyes were tired, and his expression held quiet irritation. "I said I don't eat breakfast," he muttered. Ariba kept her voice calm. "I know, but I thought maybe today you might feel different." He stared at her for a moment, almost surprised by her answer. Most people probably would have apologized and left. She did not move. After a pause, he stepped aside without saying anything. It was not an invitation exactly, but it was not a rejection either. She entered slowly. The curtains were still drawn, keeping the room dim even though sunlight shone brightly outside. The air felt heavy, as if it had not been refreshed in days. She placed the tray on a small table near the window. "Would you like me to open the curtains?" she asked gently. "No." She nodded and did not insist. For a few minutes, silence filled the room. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. She noticed books stacked unevenly near the wall, papers scattered across the desk, and a guitar covered in a thin layer of dust. It looked like someone who once had interest but had slowly stopped caring. "Why are you still here?" he asked suddenly, without looking at her. "Because it's my job," she replied honestly. He let out a quiet, dry laugh. "They always say that. Then they leave." Ariba did not know what to say to that. Instead of making promises, she simply said, "I just started. I haven't planned on leaving yet." Something in his eyes shifted, just slightly. That small moment felt important. Over the next few days, she began to notice patterns. Zion stayed inside most of the time. He avoided phone calls from his father. When guests visited the estate, he locked himself in his room. If someone insisted he join them, his mood would darken quickly. But he was not aggressive in the way rumors had described. He did not shout without reason. He did not break things daily. Instead, his anger appeared when he felt cornered, when someone tried to control his decisions or dismiss his feelings. One afternoon, while she was organizing some papers on the desk with his permission, she found a sketchbook hidden under a pile of files. It was filled with detailed drawings, landscapes, faces, abstract designs. They were beautiful, full of emotion. "You draw?" she asked before she could stop herself. He immediately walked over and closed the book. "That was years ago." "It's very good," she said sincerely. "It doesn't matter." As if he had already convinced himself of that fact long ago. Later that evening, Ariba observed something else. During dinner downstairs, his father spoke about business matters, expansion plans, responsibilities waiting to be handled. The words were sharp and direct. Though Zion was not present at the table, his name came up often. "He must learn to take charge," his father said with controlled frustration. "He cannot hide forever." The staff remained silent. Ariba listened quietly. She realized that in this house, expectations were heavy. Success was measured clearly. Weakness was not something openly accepted. The next morning, she gathered enough courage to try something small. When she brought tea to his room, she left the door slightly open after entering. Fresh air slowly began to move inside. He noticed immediately. "Close it. It feels a little stuffy," she said gently. "Just for a few minutes?" He looked annoyed but did not argue further. That was new. She decided not to push beyond that. As days passed, she started sitting quietly in the room while he read or scrolled through his phone. She did not ask many questions. She did not lecture him about responsibility. She simply existed in the same space without judgment. At first, he ignored her presence completely, but slowly he began to speak small sentences. "Did you always want to be a caregiver?" "No," she admitted. "I just needed a job." "Then why choose this one?" "Because sometimes difficult jobs teach more." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Or break you. Maybe both," she replied with a small smile. For the first time, she saw the corner of his lips lift slightly. It was not a full smile, but it was something. One afternoon, heavy clouds gathered outside. The sky turned gray, and rain began to fall steadily. The sound of raindrops hitting the window created a quiet rhythm. Ariba noticed that Zian's breathing became uneven. His fingers tightened around the book he was holding. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He stood up suddenly and walked toward the window, then stepped back as thunder echoed in the distance. She realized this reaction was not random. Instead of pointing it out directly, she said, "Storms don't last very long." He did not respond, but he did not ask her to leave either. In that moment, she understood something important. His reactions were not about anger alone. They were about memories, triggers, unspoken experiences. That evening, while passing through the hallway, she overheard two staff members whispering. "They say he changed after his mother passed away. He was close to her. And after that, everything went wrong." The words made sense. Grief can shape a person in ways others do not see. If that grief is ignored or rushed, it can turn into something heavier. Later, when she returned to his room with dinner, she found him staring at an old photograph. He quickly placed it face down when he saw her. She pretended not to notice. But now she knew. Behind the label of Mad Heir was a young man who had lost someone important and never truly healed. As the days continued, Ariba stopped seeing him as a task to manage. She saw him as someone protecting himself from further hurt. His anger was a shield. His silence was a wall, and walls are not built without reason. One evening, as she prepared to leave his room, he spoke quietly. "Why don't you look scared?" "Should I be?" she asked gently. "Everyone else is." She thought carefully before answering. "I think you're tired, not dangerous." The room fell silent. He looked at her in a way he had not before, not with irritation, not with indifference, but with confusion, as if no one had described him that way before. That was the first real crack in the wall he had built around himself. And Ariba knew that understanding someone does not happen in one big moment. It happens in small ones. A door left slightly open. A curtain moved just a little. A conversation that lasts 1 minute longer than before. I would be so happy she had entered the estate expecting chaos. Instead, she found quiet pain hidden behind locked doors. And she was beginning to see that the Heir everyone feared was not mad at the world. He was simply carrying something too heavy alone. The days passed slowly, but something subtle was changing inside the quiet walls of the estate. Ariba could feel it, even if no one else noticed yet. Zayan was still distant, still guarded, but the silence between them no longer felt sharp. It felt thoughtful. That evening, dark clouds covered the sky earlier than usual. The air felt heavy, almost restless. The servants moved quickly to close windows downstairs. The wind grew stronger, brushing against the tall trees in the garden. From her small balcony, Ariba watched the leaves shake as if they were whispering secrets to each other. She had just finished arranging some fresh flowers in the hallway when the light suddenly flickered. A second later, the entire estate fell into darkness. A few quiet gasps echoed from downstairs. Backup power usually started immediately, but for some reason it didn't. Thunder rolled across the sky, deep and powerful. Ariba's first thought was Zayan. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the way he reacted to loud sounds before. Maybe it was the memory of his tightened fingers during the last rain. Without thinking too much, she picked up a small flashlight from the hallway drawer and walked quickly toward his room. The corridor felt longer in the dark. Each step seemed louder. The storm's noise filled the silence between thunder strikes. She reached his door and knocked softly. No response. She knocked again, slightly louder. Still nothing. Her heart began to beat faster. She gently turned the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room was completely dark except for occasional flashes of lightning that lit the walls for a brief second. In one of those flashes, she saw him. He was sitting on the floor near the bed, his back against the wall, his hands pressed tightly against his ears. His breathing was heavy and uneven. She stepped inside slowly. Another loud thunderclap shook the windows. He flinched visibly. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to do. She had never seen him like this before. The confident mask he usually wore was gone. What remained was raw fear. She didn't call for help. Instead, she quietly walked over and sat down a short distance away from him. Not too close. Not too far. I brought a flashlight, she said gently, placing it on the floor between them. A soft circle of light filled part of the room. The storm continued outside, rain hitting the windows hard, but inside the room, something else was happening. His breathing was slowly matching the rhythm of her calm voice. "It's just a storm," she continued softly. "It will..." For a few long minutes, neither of them spoke. She could hear his breathing slowly become less strained. The thunder still came, but it seemed less frightening now. After a while, he lowered his hands from his ears. He kept his eyes on the floor. "I hate storms," he muttered quietly. She nodded. "They can be loud." He gave a small, humorless smile. "It's not just the noise." She waited. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. It felt like he was deciding whether to say something important. "It was raining like this," he said slowly. "The same thunder, the same sound. Steady, but it carried something deep." Ariba felt her chest tighten, but she didn't interrupt. "I remember standing by the window that night," he continued. "I kept thinking if the rain stopped, she would come back home." Lightning flashed again, but this time he didn't cover his ears. She didn't. The words were simple, but they carried years of unspoken pain. Ariba swallowed gently. "You were close to her?" He let out a quiet breath. "She was the only one who understood me." The flashlight flickered slightly, but stayed on. "My father, he believes in strength," Zayan said. "After she was gone, he told me I needed to grow up, to stop being emotional, to focus on responsibilities." His jaw tightened slightly. "I tried," he added. "I really tried." There was no anger in it right now, just exhaustion. "But every time I failed at something," he continued, "it felt like I was disappointing him, like I wasn't enough." The storm began to weaken slightly. The thunder was less frequent now. "I stopped talking after that," he said. It was easier. She understood. Sometimes silence feels safer than being misunderstood. "You're not weak for feeling," she said gently. He looked at her for the first time since she entered the room. His eyes were not filled with anger. They were searching Bar. "That's not what people here think," he replied. "Maybe they don't see everything," she said quietly. He stared at her, as if trying to understand why she was different from the others. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked suddenly. "You saw how I am." "I saw someone scared," she answered honestly. Not someone dangerous. He blinked slowly as if the idea surprised him. The backup power finally turned on. The lights flickered back to life. The room was bright again, but neither of them moved immediately. The storm outside had almost faded into a soft drizzle. Zayan slowly stood up and walked toward the window. He pulled the curtain aside slightly. The garden below looked washed and fresh under the rain. "She used to sit with me during storms," he said quietly. "She would tell me stories until it passed." Ariba stood up too, keeping a respectful distance. "You don't have to face everything alone," she said. He didn't respond right away, but he didn't disagree either. Bad night changed something between them. The next morning, when she brought tea, he didn't tell her to leave it outside. He even asked her to sit down. It was a small step, but in a house where distance had ruled for years, it felt significant. Over the following days, he spoke more often. Not constantly, not freely, but enough. He told her about the business meetings he avoided because he felt unprepared. He admitted he didn't enjoy the path chosen for him. He had once wanted to study art seriously, maybe even travel, but after his mother passed away, those dreams felt unrealistic. "I thought if I showed interest in something else, it would make things worse," he said one afternoon. "For who?" she asked gently. He didn't answer immediately. Maybe for himself. Maybe for his father. Ariba noticed that his anger was strongest when he felt pressured, when someone told him what he should be, when his grief was ignored. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't tell him what decisions to make. She simply listened. And sometimes listening is the most powerful thing a person can offer. One evening, as they sat quietly, he picked up the old sketchbook again. He flipped through the pages slowly. "I haven't drawn in years," he admitted. "You can start again," she said softly. "What if I'm not good anymore?" She smiled slightly. "Then you practice." For a moment, he hesitated. Then he reached for a pencil. The first lines were shaky, but they were there. A small crack had opened in the wall he built around himself, not because someone forced it, but because someone stayed during the storm instead of running away. And in that simple act, sitting beside him in the dark, Ariba had done something no one else had done in years. She had recognized his pain, not as weakness, but as something human. And that recognition was the beginning of change. After the night of the storm, something inside the house began to shift. It was not loud or dramatic. There were no sudden celebrations or big announcements. But the air felt different, lighter in a quiet way. Zayan still spent most of his time in his room, but the door was no longer always closed. Sometimes it stayed slightly open. Sometimes he came out without being called. Ariba noticed the small changes first. One morning when she brought tea, she found the curtains already drawn back. Sunlight filled the room, touching the walls and warming the floor. Zayan was standing near the window, looking out at the garden. "You opened the curtains," she said gently. He shrugged. It felt too dark. That simple sentence felt like progress. Over the next few days, he started following small routines. He woke up a little earlier. He ate more regularly. He even began taking short walks in the garden during quiet hours when no guests were around. At first, he walked alone. Then one day, he asked, "Do you want to come?" She didn't show her surprise. She simply nodded. The garden was large and peaceful. Birds rested on the trees, and the fountain in the center created a soft, calming sound. As they walked side by side, there was no pressure to speak. The silence between them felt comfortable now. "People think I'm unstable," Zayan said suddenly, his eyes on the ground. "Maybe I am. You went through something painful. That doesn't make you unstable." "After my mother passed away, I couldn't focus. I stopped attending meetings. I stopped caring about business plans. Every time I tried, I felt empty." "That sounds like grief," she replied softly. He stopped walking and looked at her. "Grief doesn't last this long." "It can," she said, "especially if no one talks about it." Her words stayed with him. Inside the house, the staff had begun to notice the difference too. He no longer reacted sharply to every suggestion. He didn't ignore meals completely. Once he even thanked a maid for bringing him coffee. The maid later whispered to Ariba, "What did you do?" "He's calmer." Ariba smiled slightly. "I just listen." One evening, Zayan's father requested that he join a small family dinner. Usually such invitations ended in arguments, or Zayan would refuse and his father would respond with cold disappointment. This time, when the invitation came, Zayan didn't immediately say no. He sat on the edge of his bed thinking. "They'll just talk about business again," he said quietly. "Maybe," Ariba replied. But you can choose how much you share. You don't have to become someone else, she added. Just be present. After a long pause, he stood up. I'll try, he said. Downstairs, the dining table was set perfectly, as always. His father looked surprised when Zayan walked in. The staff froze for a second, unsure how the evening would unfold. Zayan sat down quietly. For the first few minutes, conversation remained formal. His father spoke about company matters, expansion plans, investments, responsibilities. Zayan listened. Instead of reacting with frustration, he asked a calm question. Why did we decide to invest in that project? His father blinked, surprised by the tone. They began discussing it. Not arguing, discussing. It was not a perfect conversation. There were moments of tension, but there was no shouting, no door slamming, no sudden exit. Ariba watched from a distance, her heart steady. After dinner, his father called her aside privately. What have you done? He asked, not angrily, but with confusion. She answered honestly, nothing special. He hasn't joined us like that in years. His father's expression changed slightly. He refuses responsibility. Or maybe he felt unready, she replied carefully. The man remained silent. For years, he had believed that strictness would make his son stronger, that pushing him forward would prepare him for the world. He had not considered that his son might still be carrying grief quietly. That night, something shifted not only in Zayan, but in his father as well. In the following weeks, small conversations began happening between them, not long emotional talks. Just simple exchanges. How was your day? Fine. What are you working on? A design. Design. It was the first time Zayan had openly mentioned his interest in art in front of his father. The older man did not immediately criticize it, he only nodded. It was a beginning. Meanwhile, Zayan continued sketching regularly. His drawings became more confident. He spent hours refining details. Sometimes he showed them to Ariba without speaking, waiting for her reaction. They're improving, she would say honestly. Improving, he teased once. So they weren't good before? They were good, she smiled. Now they have more courage. Courage. One afternoon, Ariba found him reorganizing his desk. He was sorting old papers, throwing away unnecessary files. I'm tired of this mess, he said. It wasn't just about the desk. It was about his life. Slowly, he began attending selected business meetings, not because he was forced, but because he wanted to understand what his father expected. Instead of pretending to know everything, he asked questions. And instead of criticizing immediately, his father started answering. The house no longer felt as heavy as before. The staff walked more freely. Conversations at dinner were less tense. Even the silence felt softer. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Zayan stood near the fountain again. I used to think everyone here saw me as broken, he said. Maybe they didn't understand, Ariba replied. He looked at her thoughtfully. You didn't try to fix me. I'm not here to fix you, she said gently. You were never broken. The words stayed in the air between them. Healing did not happen overnight. There were still difficult days. Days when he felt overwhelmed. Days when he questioned himself again. But the difference was clear. He no longer shut himself away completely. He no longer reacted with immediate anger. He had started recognizing his own emotions instead of hiding from them. And perhaps most importantly, he had started speaking. One afternoon, his father entered his room quietly. It was a rare moment. I saw your sketches, the older man said. Zayan stiffened slightly. They're just drawings. They're good, his father replied simply. Silence followed. I didn't know you were still drawing, the man added. I thought you wouldn't approve, Zayan admitted. His father hesitated before answering. I was worried about the company. I forgot to ask what you needed. That sentence carried more weight than any lecture ever had. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't emotional. But it was honest. Later that evening, Zayan told Ariba about the conversation. He actually listened, he said, still surprised. She smiled. Sometimes people need time to see what's in front of them. As weeks turned into months, the estate transformed quietly. The heir, who was once locked behind closed doors, now walked freely through the halls. He spoke to the staff politely. He joined meals more often. He even suggested combining his design ideas with one of the company's projects. It wasn't about becoming someone different. It was about becoming himself, without fear. And through it all, Ariba remained steady. She didn't seek praise. She didn't expect recognition. She simply stayed. In a house filled with wealth and expectations, what had been missing all along was something simple: understanding. Months passed, and the estate no longer felt like the silent, heavy place Ariba had first walked into. The walls were the same. The chandeliers still shone brightly. The garden remained perfectly trimmed. But the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be seen with the eyes alone. It could only be felt. Zion was no longer hiding behind closed doors. He still valued his privacy, but now his door stayed open more often than it was shut. He moved through the house without tension in his shoulders. His steps were calmer, steadier. The staff no longer exchanged worried looks when his name was mentioned. Instead, they spoke of him with quiet relief. One morning, Ariba watched from the hallway as he stood in his father's office. The large room, once a place he avoided, now felt less intimidating. Papers were spread across the desk. His father was explaining something about a new project. Instead of looking bored or frustrated, Zion leaned forward, listening carefully. "I think the design could be modernized," he suggested thoughtfully. "It would attract younger clients." His father paused, considering the idea instead of dismissing it. "That might work," he replied slowly. It was a simple exchange, but it carried meaning. Respect was beginning to grow between them, built on conversation instead of pressure. Later that afternoon, Zion found Ariba in the garden. "He actually used my idea," he said, trying to sound casual but unable to hide the quiet pride in his voice. "I'm not surprised," she replied with a small smile. He looked at her thoughtfully. "A few months ago, I wouldn't have even walked into that office." She remembered the first night she had seen him sitting in the dark during the storm, the fear in his eyes, the loneliness in his voice. "You walked in because you were ready," she said gently. He shook his head slightly. "I walked in because you made me believe I could." Compliments made her uncomfortable. She had never done this job for recognition. She had simply done what felt right. "I didn't do anything special," she said quietly. "You did the work." But deep down, he knew the truth. She had done something rare. She had seen him. Not as a burden, not as a failure, but as a human being carrying pain. As the weeks continued, Zion began reconnecting with parts of himself he had buried. He enrolled in a short design course online. He started sketching regularly again, not in secret but openly. Sometimes he worked in the garden, using the sunlight for inspiration. The first time he showed one of his completed pieces to his father, there was tension in the air. But instead of criticism, his father studied the drawing carefully. "You've improved," he said. It wasn't emotional or dramatic. But for Zion, it meant everything. One evening, during dinner, something unusual happened. The conversation shifted away from business. His father asked about the design course. Zion explained his ideas with quiet confidence. There was no sharp tone, no hidden frustration. The staff noticed the difference immediately. The house no longer felt divided by silence. Later that night, his father requested to speak with Ariba privately. She entered the office respectfully, unsure of what to expect. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "When you first arrived, I doubted this would make any difference," he admitted. "We tried many professionals, many strategies." She listened quietly. "But you changed something," he continued. "How?" "I didn't try to control him," she said softly. "I listened to him." His father's expression shifted slightly. "I was afraid that if I gave him too much space, he would drift further away," the man admitted. "Sometimes," she replied gently, "people don't need pressure. They need understanding." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. For years, he had believed strength meant silence and responsibility meant emotional control. He had not realized that his son had needed comfort more than commands. That conversation marked another quiet turning point in the house. As time passed, the estate felt warmer. Laughter occasionally echoed through the halls. Zion began hosting small creative sessions in one of the unused rooms, turning it into a workspace filled with sketches and ideas. He even invited a few young designers to collaborate. The Mad Heir label slowly disappeared. People began calling him thoughtful, creative, focused. There were still moments of doubt. Some days he felt overwhelmed by expectations. But some days old memories returned heavily. But now, instead of shutting himself away completely, he spoke about it. One rainy afternoon, similar to the night of the storm months ago, thunder rolled softly across the sky. Ariba noticed him standing by the window again. But this time, his hands were relaxed. "Storms don't scare me like they used to," he said quietly. She smiled. "Why?" "Because now I know they pass." The words carried deeper meaning than weather alone. A few weeks later, Ariba received a call from the agency that had first placed her in the job. They asked if she wished to renew her contract for another year. The salary would increase. The position would remain secure. She hesitated, not because she feared the job, but because things were different now. Zayan was no longer someone who needed constant supervision. He was learning to manage himself. He was rebuilding his relationship with his father. He was finding his own balance. That evening, she told him about the call. "So you might leave?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "It's a possibility," she said honestly. He was silent for a while. "You don't have to stay because of me," he said eventually. "I know," she replied gently. "But I don't want you to think I can't handle things without you." She looked at him carefully. "I don't think that," she assured him. "You've grown stronger." He nodded slowly. "Then stay," he said after a pause, almost awkwardly. "Not as someone managing me, just stay." She smiled softly. In the end, she chose to renew the contract, but under slightly different terms. Her role shifted from strict caregiver to personal assistant and creative support. It felt less like supervision and more like partnership. Months later, during a small gathering at the estate to celebrate a successful company project, Zayan stood confidently among guests. He spoke clearly about combining art and business ideas. He thanked his father publicly for giving him space to grow. Then, unexpectedly, he added something else. "And sometimes," he said, glancing toward Ariba, "all a person needs is someone who listens." His father followed his gaze and nodded in quiet agreement. Ariba stood near the back, not seeking attention. But in that moment, she realized something powerful. She had come to the estate for money, for survival, for her family. But she had found something else. She had witnessed how understanding can rebuild a person. The heir who was once locked in darkness now stood in the light, not because he was forced, not because he was fixed, but because he was finally seen. And sometimes, being seen is the first step toward healing. The estate remained grand and beautiful as always, but now it also held something it had been missing for years. Peace. Not perfect peace. Not permanent happiness, but the kind that comes when pain is acknowledged instead of ignored. Ariba had been sent to care for a mad heir. Instead, she became the only one who recognized his pain, and in recognizing it, she helped him recognize himself.